All right, welcome back. In chapter 2, we will talk about some drug regulations and FDA approval of the drugs. A quick brief history of drug legislation. Again, you will never be tested on the drug history. This is just FYI slide. In 1848, the act was passed that required all drugs entering the US be inspected and analyzed for quality, purity, and fitness for medical purposes. Remember, there was a time when we didn't have any law that required pharmaceutical companies to make sure that the drug is pure. Unfortunately, in some countries, that is still the case. We are very privileged to live in a country where we know that if I'm going to take amoxicillin, at least I know that in that bottle or in that capsule, it is amoxicillin indeed, and not some placebo chemical, if you will. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act required for pharmaceutical companies to have accurate labeling of the ingredient. We need to know what we are taking, and so forth. Also, this is important. In 1912, the law required the pharmaceutical companies to not to sell a drug with false claims. In other words, we cannot market a drug stating that, oh, this drug will treat diabetes or cure diabetes, because we know that diabetes is a chronic disorder, and we control it, we minimize the symptoms, but we really don't have a drug that can eliminate diabetes or COPD for that matter. So no false claims. 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act, to keep record of narcotics. Then we had 1938, the FDA prevent the sale of newly developed drug without thoroughly tested for safety. In 1970, the Controlled Substance Act categorized drugs into 5 categories. We call them schedule. I'm sure you have heard of scheduled drugs. So that came after 1970. This slide talks about those scheduled drugs, drug controlled substances, if you will. The FDA organized these drugs into 5 categories, or 5 schedules: Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We write these schedules in a using Roman numerals. Now, Schedule 1 has the highest abuse potential, and Schedule 5 has the least or the lowest abuse potential. And the drug that fall under Schedule 1 are not prescribed. We do not prescribe these drugs. There's no acceptable medical use. These are the examples. Now, I know some people might believe that marijuana in some states, yes, but at a federal level, this is still a Schedule 1 drug. Schedule 1 drugs are usually studied, on the animals, and they're used in the labs, but they're not prescribed. Schedule 2 drugs, on the other hand, are prescribed. These drugs have high potential for abuse, and the examples would be, I'm sure you're familiar with these drugs: hydrocodone, Vicodin, and Norco, Demerol, oxycodone, and so forth. These medications are heavily regulated, and no refills are allowed. We cannot write refills on these medications. All right. Schedule 3 also has abuse potential, but it's a moderate. Um, and these are less strict controls, still controlled. Refills are allowed. So the example would be Tylenol with a codeine and so forth. Schedule 4 drugs have a low potential abuse. Um, very similar to Schedule 3, refills are allowed. So these are your anti-anxiety medication like a Xanax, Ativan, and so forth, Ambien, Tramadol. And Schedule 5 is your lowest potential abuse. Refills are allowed. So when you have a cough medication, well, Robitussin is over the counter, of course, but when you add codeine in it, that becomes a Schedule 5 drug because of the controlled component. Well, FDA Mission, we know that the main concept is to protect the public by ensuring safety and so forth. FDA is also responsible for regulating the manufacturing and marketing and distribution of tobacco product to protect the public health and to decrease the tobacco use by minor to stop, I guess, by minors and so forth. All right, talking about drug approval process. There are several steps that we have to take before we can come up with a new drug. On any given day, there are multiple trials happening, in every state. Something that we call preclinical trials, preclinical research, and once you see something promising, you can make a drug out of that chemical. Then then a pharmaceutical company would write an application, will submit an application to FDA, something that we call the investigational new drug IND number. Once they obtain the number, then the drug enter into the clinical trials, the clinical investigation. There are 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then if everything goes smoothly the way it's planned, and if the drug is considered safe, they will submit the data to FDA again, and to obtain the new drug. So they will get the approval so that they can start marketing the drug, but they still have to continue to do the research and submit the information, something that we call post-marketing surveillance. All right, so the first step, as I mentioned, is a preclinical research. We don't know the drug yet. We don't call, there's no name. It's a chemical that is being extensively studied and tested on laboratory animals. These are usually small animals like rats, mouse, and so forth. These studies are not regulated by FDA. You do not need a permission or special permission. These labs are these are approved agencies, by the way, who are doing the research, but the study itself is not regulated by FDA. So when they're doing these research on these animals, and if they see something promising, they will file an application, and the drug will enter into a clinical phase, phase 1. That chemical will be tested on a very small number of human volunteers. Remember, before the phase 1, the chemical was tested on the animals. Now we are testing on these volunteers. The number is small, almost always less than 100 people. We are really studying the chemistry of the drug at that time, more interested in bioavailability, how this drug is going to be absorbed, what is the rate of absorption, how is it metabolized, and so we really trying to define the pharmacological effect of that drug in humans. Phase 2 will talk about phase 2 will further expand the study in several hundred informed humans. Again, these are volunteers, and you have to have a consent, of course. And this is when we actually bring placebo, and the drug is compared with a placebo drug. All right. Now, phase 3, you expand the trial to really study the safety and efficacy of that drug in various settings, in hospital setting, outpatient settings. We try to get as much as information from these trials. If everything goes smoothly, they have enough information, the drug will enter into another phase, and then the pharmaceutical company will send an application called a New Drug Application, NDA, to examine all of the preclinical and clinical data. At this time, FDA will either approve or not approve the drug. If the drug is approved at this time, then the drug will enter into a marketing phase, or post-marketing surveillance will start. The pharmaceutical companies are responsible to continue to evaluate the drug. They will need more data to really justify or give more information in diverse population. So now we are including thousands and thousands of people, different ethnicity, different age group, women's versus men, geriatric versus adult, Hispanic, Asians, African American, so forth. Any pharmaceutical company that is going to market a drug must have FDA approval. You cannot start marketing a drug without FDA approval. All right, prescription versus non-prescription or over-the-counter drugs. Well, prescription drugs, so when the FDA approve these drugs, so they have to decide if this is going to be a prescription medication or over-the-counter medication. The criteria for prescription medication is that these drugs are addicting. So if you have a drug with higher addiction property, then that drug will not be over-the-counter, let's put it this way. Or if the drug is too complex for self-administration, you need a skill such as IV or IM injection, that cannot be over-the-counter. If the drug is used to treat a complex condition, that would be a prescription drug. If a drug requires blood monitoring, if you need to monitor CBC or liver panel and so forth, then that can't be over the counter. If drug requires authorization or pre-authorizations, then that would be a prescription drug. You have to see the provider and ask for the authorization. Now, the advantage of a prescription drug is that the patient will be able to patient must see the provider, even though that is a barrier. But the advantage is somebody is going to examine the patient, somebody is going to assess the patient, appropriately diagnose the patient, and provide education, and you can have a follow-up with the patient. The disadvantage of the prescription is, of course, more expensive, time-consuming. You have to make an appointment to see the provider and pay co-pay, and prescription medications are more expensive, and you need so that could be a barrier, if you will. Now, over-the-counter, any drug that has very high safety margin, is considered as over the counter. It is possible to start a drug as a prescription drug, and later on, when you studied the drug, when you have enough information, you decide that this drug has a very high safety margin, so that can be reclassified as over the counter. One example would be acetaminophen, Tylenol. There was a time when it was a prescription drug, and now we know it's over the counter. Another example that I'm sure you recall is Flonase, a nasal inhaler. There was a time when this used to be a prescription drug, and now, of course, it is over the counter. So the drugs can be reclassified if there's a promising data that there's a high safety margin. The risk of over-the-counter medication is that we want to be able to monitor as a clinicians. There might be a significant drug or food interaction, and then there's no follow-up care, so that is always an issue. And we see this with decongestant medications, some over-the-counter cough medications, and so forth. Orphan drug is a drug that have been discovered but are not financially viable, and therefore have not been adopted by the drug company. So that's orphan drug. All right, supplements. Well, supplements are those herbs and dietary supplements. These are not drugs. The reason behind that is because they are not FDA approved. They are not monitored or tested by FDA for safety. So remember in the beginning, in first chapter, I said, can anything be called drug? Well, yeah, because anything that has a potential to either minimize a symptom or to make any chemical changes can be called drugs. But from a legal standpoint of view, if you have a product that you believe can treat a symptom of a disease, but if you have not got approval from FDA, technically speaking, you cannot advertise that or market that product as a drug. We would have to call that as a supplement, because supplements are not FDA approved. So technicality right there. So it is our responsibility to let the patient know that I am okay. I tell them I am okay if you want to use that supplement, but just understand that I don't know what's in it, or there's no FDA approval for safety. It can cause a side effect and can have a drug-food interaction. One example I can think of right now that I come across a lot on the clinical practice is St. John's wort. St. John's wort is it is a flower, that can be processed into a tea or a tablet. It's very nice, yellow, beautiful flower, yellow color flower, and it can increase the amount of serotonin or norepinephrine and even dopamine in the brain. So people use that to treat depression, but because it is not regulated by FDA, we have to be very, very careful. It does not interact, well, I'm sorry, it does not get along with other drugs or other medications. So there's a huge drug interaction. For example, digoxin, Dilantin, narcotics, Coumadin, and so forth. If the patient is taking those drugs, then on top of that, patient is taking St. John's wort, and the herb can decrease the effect of other drugs. So something to keep in mind. Off-label is a concept where the FDA approved a drug for one disorder, let's say, but later on there's a clinical support that can demonstrate that this drug can be used for something else that was not necessarily approved by the FDA initially. And it is a very well acceptable practice. It is again, it's not something that's illegal. We do this a lot. One example I can think of right now is trazodone. And trazodone is actually an antidepressant medication, and the side effect of a trazodone is drowsiness. And we take a benefit of that side effect, if you will, and we use that drug for a patient who have insomnia. So we give trazodone at nighttime, not to treat a depression, but to treat insomnia. Another example could be a drug that may have a side effect of appetite stimulant, a weight gain, like a Remeron is antidepressant, and I use that in geriatric patient to stimulate their appetite for weight loss, for them to gain weight. That's the side effect. And so these are off-label, again, not FDA approved, but very acceptable practice. And that's all I have for now. And if you have any questions, please email me, and I will see you in next chapter.